Okay, there we are. Isn't that much better? We're going to have to fix that. Okay, so just stating off, we are doing the Count of Monte Cristo chapter 35. Franz and Albert are sitting down to a breakfast with the Count, and they're talking about what they're going to be doing for the carnival and also the executions that are just about to happen. All right, any questions? No? Good. Here we are. Whoops. Let's try that again. Here we go.
The two young men arose and entered the breakfast room.
During the meal, which was excellent and admirably served, Franz looked repeatedly at Albert in order to observe the impressions which he doubted not had been made on him by the words of their entertainer, but whether his usual carelessness he had paid but little attention to him, whether the explanation of the Count of Monte Cristo with regard to dueling had satisfied him, or whether the events which Franz knew that all felt a little sloppy, so we're going to start over again and dive back in. Here we go.
The two young men arose and entered the breakfast room.
During the meal, which was excellent and admirably served, Franz looked repeatedly at Albert in order to observe the impressions which he doubted not had been made on him by the words of their entertainer, but whether his usual carelessness he had paid but little attention to him, whether the explanation of the Count of Monte Cristo with regard to dueling had satisfied him, or whether the events which Franz knew had had their effect on him alone, he remarked that his companion did not pay the least regard to them, but on the contrary...
Him alone, he remarked.
So back to he remarked. And start me up. He remarked.
Franz knew had had their effect on him alone.
He remarked that his companion did not pay the least regard to them, but on the contrary, ate like a man who for the last 4 or 5 months had been condemned to partake of Italian cookery. That is, the worst in the world. That's funny.
Italian cookery, that is, the worst in the world.
Okay, that's funny. Good. There we go.
That is, the worst in the world.
As for the Count, he just touched the dishes. He seemed to fulfill the duties of a host. He seemed to fulfill the duties of the host. Here we go.
That is, the worst in the world.
As for the Count, he just touched the dishes. He seemed to fulfill the duties of a host by sitting down with his guests and awaited their departure to be served some strange or more delicate food. This brought back to Franz, in spite of himself, the recollection of the terror in
Good food. Departure to be served some strange or more delicate food.
This brought back to Franz, in spite of himself, the recollection of the terror with which the Count had inspired the Countess G, and her firm conviction that the man in the opposite box was a vampire. At the end of the breakfast, Franz took out his watch. "Well," said the Count, "what are you doing?" "You must excuse us, Count," returned Franz, "but we still have much to do." "What may that be?" "We have no masks, and it is absolutely necessary to procure them." "Do not concern yourself about that. We have, I think, a private room in the Piazza del Popolo. I will have whatever costumes you choose brought to us, and you can dress there." "After the execution," cried Franz. "Before or after, whichever you please." "Opposite the scaffold." "The scaffold forms part of the fete." We're going to have to fix that hymn part. So we're going to take a little note and fixing a part from him to them. You won't understand what that means, but that's fine. Him. Fix. Okay, where are we?
Opposite the scaffold.
There we go. Mm-mm.
Opposite the scaffold.
The scaffold forms part of the fete. Count, I have reflected on the matter, said Franz. I thank you for your courtesy. I thank you for your courtesy. I thank you for your courtesy. I thank you for not warming up far enough so that your mouth can actually operate. Here we go. I swear I did my warm-ups. I swear. All right.
I've reflected on the matter, said Franz.
I thank you for your courtesy, but I shall content myself with accepting a place in your carriage and at your window at Rospoli Palace, and I leave you at liberty to dispose of my place at the Piazza del Popolo. But I warn you, you will lose a very curious sight, returned the Count. You will describe it to me, replied Franz, and the recital from your lips will make as great an impression on me as if I had witnessed it. I've more than once intended witnessing an execution, but I have never been able to make up my mind. And you, Albert? Replied the Viscount. I saw Castaigne executed, but I think I was rather intoxicated that day, for I had quitted college the same morning, and we had passed the previous night at a tavern. Hold on, and who stuck him? We have to figure out who's talking. Yes, nearby. I think it's still Albert talking. All right.
College the same morning, and we had passed the previous night at a tavern.
Besides, it is no reason because you have not seen an execution at Paris that you should not see one anywhere else. When you travel, it is to see everything. Think what a figure you will make when you are asked, "How do they execute in Rome?" And you reply, "I do not know." Oh, that's the Count. Okay, so the Count is a little scarier. Let's try that again.
College the same morning, and we had passed the previous night at a tavern.
Besides, it is no reason because you have not seen an execution at Paris that you should not see one anywhere else. When you travel, it is to see everything. Think what a figure you will make when you are asked, "How do they execute at Rome?" And you reply, "I do not know." And besides, they say that the culprit is an infamous scoundrel who killed with a log of wood worthy.
They say that the
We're a little quieter this morning, too.
No. And besides,
Let's get that besides.
I do not know. And you reply, I do not know.
And besides, they say that the culprit is an infamous scoundrel who killed with a log of wood a worthy canon who had brought him up like his own son. My God, when a churchman is killed, it should be with a different weapon than a log, especially when he has behaved like a father. If you went to Spain, would you not see the bullfights? Well, suppose it is a bullfight you are going to see. Recollect the ancient Romans of the circus and the sports where they killed 300 lions and 100 men. Think of the 80,000 applauding spectators, the sage matrons who took their daughters, and the charming vestals who made with the thumb of their white hands the fatal sign that said, "Come, dispatch the dying." "Shall you go then, Albert?" asked Franz. "Of course. Like you, I hesitated, but the Count's eloquence decides me." Ooh, that's Albert, not Franz. Of course. Of course. Albert's kind of a surfer dude. Love him. Love him. Here we go.
Albert asked Franz.
Of course. Like you, I hesitated, but the Count's eloquence decides me. "Let us go, then," said Franz, "since you wish it. But on our way to the Piazza del Popolo, I wish to pass through the Corso. Is this possible, Count?" "On foot, yes. In a carriage, no." "I will go on foot, then." "Is it important that you should go that way?" Yes, there is something I wish to see. Well, we will go by the Corso. We will send the carriage to wait for us on the Piazza del Popolo by the Via del Babuino, for I shall be glad to pass myself through the Corso, to see if some orders I have given have been executed. Excellency, said a servant opening the door. There we go. We're in rhythm. Feeling it now, feeling it now. Yup, yup, yup.
I have given have been executed.
Excellency, said a servant opening the door. A man in the dress of a penitent wishes to speak to you. Oh, yes, returned the Count. I know who he is, gentlemen. Oh, I know who he is. Gentlemen.
Oh, yes, returned the Count.
I know who he is. Gentlemen, will you return to the salon? You will find good cigars on the center table. I will be with you directly. The young man rose and returned into the salon, while the Count, again apologizing, left by another door. Albert, who was a great smoker, and who had considered it no small sacrifice to be deprived of the cigars at the Café de Paris, approached the table and uttered a cry of joy at perceiving some veritable purities.
Approached the table and uttered a Café de Paris. Approached the table and uttered.
See, we're going to keep that breath right there because it's real. Sometimes you got to have a real breath. Breath is real. Breathe real. Here we go. Pop.
Paris. Approached the table.
And uttered a cry of joy at perceiving some veritable puros. Well, asked Franz, what do you think of the Count of Monte Cristo? What do I think? Said Albert, evidently surprised at such a question from his companion. I think he is a delightful fellow. Who does the honors of his delightful fellow who does the honors of his table admirably. Delightful fellow who does the
Surprised at such a question from his companion.
I think he is a delightful fellow who does the honors of his table admirably, who has traveled much, read much, is like Brutus of the Stoic school, is like Brutus of the Stoic. We're going to start that all over again, because it just feels like a good monologue to be
Surprised at such a question from his companion.
I think he is a delightful fellow who does the honors of his table admirably, who has traveled much, read much, is like Brutus of the Stoic school, and moreover, added he, sending a volume of smoke up towards the ceiling, that he has excellent cigars. Sometimes you're just going to have to burp in the middle of a sentence. Not always, but sometimes. All right, let's see where we're at.
That he has excellent cigars.
Such was Albert's opinion of the Count, and as Franz well knew that Albert professed never to form an opinion except upon long reflection. Okay, we are going too fast. Let's back this up a little bit, because we've just had breakfast. Let's let the breakfast sit. Let's sit back, have a cigar.
That he has excellent cigars.
Such was Albert's opinion of the Count, and as Franz knew well that Albert professed never to form an opinion except upon long reflection, he made no attempt to change it. Okay. Such was Albert's opinion of the Count, and as Franz well knew that Albert professed never to form an opinion except upon... Oh, why do I want to add a G to upon? Except upon... That
he has excellent cigars.
Such was Albert's opinion of the Count, and as Franz knew well that Albert professed never to form an opinion except upon long reflection, he made no attempt to change it. But, he said, did you observe one very singular thing? What? How attentively he looked at you. At me. Yes. Albert reflected. Oh, he replied, that is not very surprising. I've been more than a year absent from Paris, and my clothes are of a most antiquated cut. The Count takes me for a provincial. The first opportunity you have, undeceive him, I beg, and tell him I am nothing of the kind. Franz smiled. An instant after, the Count entered. Okay, cool. We know why the Count is staring at Albert, because Albert should have been his son. Maybe that's how it all ends out. Turns out he actually is in the movie. Don't watch the movie. For God's sake. 400,000 word book and you watch a 90-minute movie. Tisk, tisk, tisk. All right.
An instant after, the Count entered.
I'm now quite at your service, gentlemen, he said. The carriage is going one way to the Piazza del Popolo, and we will go another. And if you please, by the Corso. Take some more of these cigars, Mr. de Morcerf. With all my heart, returned Albert. Italian cigars are horrible. When you come to
Cigars are horrible. Returned Albert. Italian cigars are horrible.
When you come to Paris, I will return all this. I will not refuse. I intend going there soon, and since you allow me, I will pay you a visit. Come, we have not any time to lose. It is 12:30. Let us set off. All three descended. The coachman received his master's orders and drove down the Via del Buino, while the three gentlemen walked along the Piazza di Spagna and the Via Frattina, which led directly between the Fioni and Rospoli palaces. Franz's attention was directed towards the windows of that last palace, for he had not forgotten the signal agreed upon between the man in the mantle and the Trastevere peasant. "Which are your windows?" he asked of the Count, with as much indifference as he could assume. "The three last," he returned, with a negligence evidently unaffected, for he could not imagine what intention the question was put. Franz glanced rapidly toward the three windows. The side windows were hung with yellow damask, and the center one with white damask and a red cross. The man in the mantle had kept his promise to the Trastevere, and there could... shit. That was almost.
With white damask and a red cross.
The man in the mantle had kept his promise to the Trastevere, and there could now be no doubt that he was the Count. The three windows were still unattended. Preparations were making on every side, chairs were placed, scaffolds were raised, and windows were hung with flags. The masks could not appear, the carriages could not move about, but the masks were visible behind the windows, the carriages, and the doors. Franz, Albert, and the Count continued to descend on the Corso. As they approached the Piazza del Popolo, the crowd became more dense, and above the heads of the multitude 2 objects were visible. One obelisk, surmounted by a cross. One obelisk surmounted by a cross. Okay, here we go.
Multitude, 2 objects were visible.
I lost my spot. It's okay. I heard a little crackling. It's time for some water. Yes, it is. Always a good time for some water. All right. The mass obelisk. There we go. Visible.
Multitude, 2 objects were visible.
The obelisk, surmounted by a cross which marks the center of the square, and in front of the obelisk, at the point where the three streets, got a little snap between the teeth. Not good either, but that's fine. We're just getting rocking. We can always clean that up.
Multitude, 2 objects were visible.
The obelisk, surmounted by a cross, which marks the center of the square, and in front of the obelisk, at the point where the 3 streets, del Bauino, del Corso, and di Ripetta, meet Where three streets meet. I'm just where the three streets meet. Where three streets meet. And you're saying, can you do that? Absolutely. All right. Okay. Multitude, two objects were visible. Here we go. Pop and pop.
Multitude, two objects were visible.
The obelisk, surmounted by a cross, which marks the center of the square. Hi, William Shatner. Are you just about to take on some Klingons? Jeez. Here we go.
Two objects were visible.
The obelisk, surmounted by a cross, which marks the center of the square. And in front of the obelisk, at the point where the three streets meet, the two uprights of the scaffold, between which glittered the curved knife of the executioner. Oh, of the guillotine, of the mandaya. The curved knife of the guillotine. It's got to be the guillotine. Well, it's a mandaya. Let's put the guillotine. That's fine. Make sure I spell it correctly, though. Here we go.
Oh.
Whoa, whoa, whoa.
The obelisk, surmounted by a cross, which marks the center of the square. And in front of the obelisk, at the point where the three streets meet, the two uprights of the scaffold, between...
Okay, we're just listening back to see where we should make our cut. We're going to put our cut right there.
Streets meet, the two uprights of the scaffold,
between which glittered the curved knife of the guillotine. At the corner of the street they met the Count's steward, who was awaiting his master. The window, let at an exorbitant price, which the Count had doubtless wished to conceal from his guests, was on the second floor of the great palace, situated between the Via del Bauino and the Monte Piccino. It consisted... Second floor of the great palace. Boom. Just not feeling the Italian today. I don't know what it is.
Bauino and the Monte's guests was on the second floor of the great palace, situated... was on the second floor of the great palace. His guests was on the second floor of the great palace.
It consisted, as we have said, of a small dressing room opening into a bedroom, and when the door of communication was shut, the inmates were quite alone. On chairs were laid elegant masquerade of costumes of blue and white satin. Was laid an elegant masquerade. Sugar, 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 sugar. Okay. Quite alone.
Communication was shut. The inmates were quite alone.
On chairs were laid an elegant masquerade of costumes of blue and white satin. As you left the choice of your costumes to me, said the Count to the two friends, I have had these brought. They will be the most worn this year, and they are the most suitable, on account of the confetti, as they do not show the flower. Franz heard the words of the Count, but imperfectly, and he perhaps did not fully appreciate this new attention to their wishes, for he was wholly absorbed by the spectacle that the Piazza del Popolo presented, and by the terrible instrument that was in the center. It was the first time Franz had ever seen a guillotine. We say guillotine because the Roman mandaia is formed on almost the same model as the French instrument. The knife, which is shaped like a crescent that cuts with the convex side, falls from a less height, and that is all the difference. Bam. Is all the difference, and that makes all the difference. It's the road less traveled. It's the road less traveled. It's the road less traveled. Here we go.
Falls from a less height, and that is all the difference.
Two men seated on the movable plank on which the victim is laid. They were eating their breakfasts while waiting for the criminal. Their repast consisted apparently of bread and sausages. One of them lifted the plank, took out a flask of wine, drank some, and then passed it to his companion. These two men were the executioner's assistants. These two men were the executioner's assistants.
Drank some and then passed it to his companion.
These two men were the executioner's assistants. At this sight, Franz felt the perspiration start forth upon his brow. You just lost concentration there, buddy. You're thinking about other things, and that's okay. Thinking about other things, and that's okay.
Men were the executioner's assistants.
At this sight, Franz felt the perspiration start forth upon his brow. The prisoners transported the previous evening from the Carcere Nuove. Nuove. I got it right. It's just a Carcere Nuove.
Start forth upon his brow.
The prisoners, transported the previous evening from the Carcere Nuove to the little church of Santa Maria del Popolo, had passed the night, each accompanied by two priests, in a chapel closed by a grating, before which were two sentinels, who were relieved at intervals. A double line of carbineers, placed on each side of the door of the church, reached to the scaffold and formed a circle around it, leaving a path about 10 feet wide, and around the guillotine a space of nearly 100 feet. All the rest of the square was paved with heads. Many women held their infants on their shoulders, and thus the children had the best view. The Monte Pincino seemed a vast amphitheater filled with spectators. The balconies of the two churches at the corner of the Via del Boino and the Via di Repetto were crammed. The balconies of the two churches at the corner were crammed.
Via del Boino. View.
Babies had the best view. Babies love their death. Babies just love their death. Here we go.
And thus the children had the best view.
The Monte Pincino seemed a vast amphitheater filled with spectators. The balconies of the two churches at the corner were crammed. The steps even seemed a party-colored sea, and that was impelled towards the portico. Every niche in the wall held its living statue. What the Count said was true. The most curious spectacle in life is that of death. And yet, instead of the silence and the solemnity demanded, I don't know, I love that word, but it's so hard to say, solemnity. And yet, babies love their death. Okay, here we go. All right, we're rocking it. Okay. Beans. Here we go.
Life is that of death.
And yet, instead of the silence and the solemnity demanded by the occasion, laughter and jests arose from the crowd. It was evident that the execution was, in the eyes of the people, only the commencement of the carnival. Suddenly the tumult ceased, as if by magic, and the doors of the church opened. A brotherhood of penitents, clothed from head to foot in robes of gray sackcloth, with holes for eyes, and holding in their hands lighted tapers, appeared first. The chief marched at the head. Behind the penitents came a man of vast stature and proportions. He was naked, with the exception of cloth drawers at the side of which hung a large knife in a sheath, and he bore on his right shoulder a heavy iron sledgehammer. This man was the executioner. He had, moreover, sandals bound on his feet by cords. Behind the executioner came, in the order in which they were to die, first Peppino and then Andrea. Each was accompanied by two priests. Neither had his eyes bandaged. And you're going, why is it Andrea instead of Andre? And the reason is because he's Italian. Okay, let's get some water. Did I say neither or neither?
Each was accompanied by two priests. Neither had his eyes bandaged.
Cool. I like to keep track of neither and neither, or either and either, because I don't want to mix it up. So if I'm sticking with one, I want to stick with it all the way through. And I like the English pronunciation, either, neither, instead of either, neither. So here we go.
Neither had his eyes bandaged.
Peppino walked with a firm step, doubtless aware of what awaited him. Andrea was supported by 2 priests. Each of them, from time to time, kissed the crucifix a confessor held out to him. At this sight alone, Franz felt his legs tremble under him. He looked at Albert. He was as white as his shirt. He was as white as his shirt. He looked at Albert. He was as white as his shirt. There we go.
He looked at Albert.
There we go.
Franz felt his legs tremble under him. He looked at Albert.
He was as white as his shirt, and mechanically cast away his cigar, although he had not half smoked it. The Count alone seemed unmoved. Nay, more, a slight color seemed striving to rise in his pale cheeks. His nostrils dilated like those of a wild beast that scents its prey, and his lips, half open, disclosed his white teeth, small and sharp like those of a jackal. And yet his features wore an expression of smiling tenderness, such as Franz had never before witnessed in them. His black eyes especially were full of kindness and pity. However, the 2 culprits advanced, and as they approached, their faces became visible. Peppino was a handsome young man of 24 or 25. 4, 5, 20. So French. Okay. Peppino was a handsome man. Yes, he was. He was a very handsome man. That's okay. See where we are? Peppino was a handsome man. He was a handsome young man.
Advanced, and as they approached, their faces became visible.
Peppino was a handsome young man of 24 or 25, bronzed by the sun. He carried his head. He carried his heed. He carried his heed. He carried his heed. He didn't carry his heed. He carried his head. As far as I'm concerned, as far as anybody should be concerned.
A man of 24 or 25, bronzed by the sun.
He carried his head erect and seemed on the watch to see on which side his liberator would appear. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense when you say it correctly. Righty, here we go.
Bronzed by the sun.
He carried his head erect and seemed on the watch to see on which side his liberator would appear. Andrea was short and fat, his visage marked with brutal cruelty. I was going to say beautiful cruelty, but not. It was brutal cruelty. Brutal cruelty. Here we go.
To see on which side his liberator would appear.
Andrea was short and fat. His visage, marked with brutal cruelty, did not indicate age. He might be 30. In prison he had suffered his beard to grow, his head fell on his shoulder, his legs bent beneath him, and his movements were apparently automatic and unconscious. "I thought," said Franz to the Count, "that you told me there would be but one execution." "I told you true," he replied coldly. "I told you true. I told you true. What did you tell me? I told you true." Here we go.
That you told me there would be but one execution.
I told you true, he replied coldly. "And yet here there are 2 culprits." "Yes, but only one of these 2 is about to die. The other has many years to live." "If the pardon is to come, there is no time to lose." "And see, here it is," said the Count. At that moment when...
I told you true, he replied coldly.
There we go. I told you.
Here it is, said the Count. See, here it is, said the Count.
At the moment when Peppino reached the foot of the guillotine, a priest arrived in some haste, forced his way through the soldiers, and, advancing to the chief of the Brotherhood, gave him a folded paper. The piercing eye of Peppino had noticed all. The chief took the paper, unfolded it, and raising his hand, "Heaven be praised, and his holiness also," he said in a loud voice. "Here is a pardon for one of the prisoners." "A pardon!" cried the people with one voice. "A pardon!" At this cry, Andrea raised his head. Andrea.
A pardon. At this cry,
Boop-a-doo-doo.
pardon, cried the people with one voice. A pardon.
At this cry, Andrea raised his head. "Pardon for whom?" he cried. Peppino remained breathless. "A pardon for Peppino, called Rocca Priori," said the principal friar. And he passed the paper to the officer commanding the carbineers, who read and returned it to him. "For Peppino!" cried Andrea, who seemed roused from the torpor in which he had been plunged. "Why for him and not for me? We ought to die together. I was promised he should die with me. You have no right to put me to death alone. I will not die alone. I will not!" And he broke from the priest, struggling and raving like a wild beast, and striving desperately to break the cords that bound his hands. The executioner made a sign, and his two assistants leapt from the scaffold to seize him. "What is going on?" asked Franz of the count, for as all the talk was in the Roman dialect, he had not perfectly understood it. "Do you not see," returned the count, "that this human creature is Wow, look at the size difference in the waveform when I am supporting a yelling, dying man. Oops. It's a good thing we know about compression, isn't it? Okay, here we go.
Do you not see? Returned the count.
That this human creature who is about to die is furious, that his fellow sufferer does not perish with him, and were he able he would rather tear him to pieces with his teeth and nails than let him enjoy the life he himself is about to be deprived of. Oh, man, race of crocodiles, cried the count, extending his clenched hands towards the crowd. How well do I recognize you there, and that at all times you are worthy of yourselves. Meanwhile, Andrea and the two executioners were struggling on the ground, and he kept exclaiming, "He ought to die! He shall die! I will not die alone!" Look, cried the count, seizing the young men's hands. "Look, for on my soul it is curious. Here is a man who had resigned himself to his fate, who was going to the scaffold to die, like a coward. It is true. Whoop.
To die like a coward. It is
Curious. I want to try that whole monologue in one sitting, please.
For on my soul it is curious.
Here is a man who had resigned himself to his fate, who was going to the scaffold to die. Like a coward, it is true, but he was about to die without resistance. Do you know what gave him strength? Do you know what consoled him? It was that another partook of his punishment. Please tell me there's no breath.
Do you know what consoled him?
Oh, so good. Okay, so we're not going to get this all in one spot. Oh, well.
Here is a man who has...
Nope. Let's cut that out. There we go. Sold him.
Do you know what gave him strength? Do you know what consoled him?
It was that another partook of his punishment, that another partook of his anger. Oh, anguish, not anger. Oh, it was so good. I hate to see a performance scrapped, but there you go. We got to get through it one step at a time. Oh, we are warmed up, though, ready for a day of recording. Not for this, but for other things.
Do you know what gave him strength? Do you know what consoled him?
It was that another partook of his punishment, that another partook of his anguish, that another was to die before him. Lead 2 sheep to the butcher's, 2 oxen to the slaughterhouse, and make one of them understand that his companion will not die. The sheep will bleat for pleasure, the ox will bellow with joy, but man, whom God created in his own image, man upon whom God has laid his fist, his sole companion. Just didn't quite get there. Oh, what a piece of work is man.
Its own image, man upon whom.
Here we go. Bop, 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 bop. No, we're going to need a little more chapstick. Okay. Got about 15 more minutes in the studio. Well, in this part of the studio, but we are cooking along. Already cut 20 minutes in 45. That is a sexy time. So here we go. Image. In his image.
Man whom God created in his own image.
Man upon whom God has laid his sole commandment to love his neighbor. Man to whom God has given a voice to express his thoughts. What it is. Wow. It was a good change, though. How noble in reason. What a piece of.
A voice to express his thoughts.
What is his first cry when he hears his fellow man is saved? A blasphemy. Honor to man, this masterpiece of nature, this king of creation. And the Count burst into a laugh, a terrible laugh, that showed he must have suffered horribly to be able thus to laugh. However, the struggle still continued, and it was dreadful to witness. The 2 assistants carried Andrea up to the scaffold. The people all took part against Andrea, and 20,000 voices cried, "Put him to death! Put him to death!" Franz sprang back, but the Count seized his arm and held him before the window. "What are you doing?" he said. "Do you pity him? If you heard the cry of mad dog, you would take your gun. You would unhesitatingly shoot the poor beast, who, after all, was only guilty of having been bitten by another dog. And yet you pity a man who, without being bitten by one of his race, has yet murdered his benefactor, and who, now unable to kill anyone because his hands are bowed, wishes to see his companion in captivity perish. No, look. The recommendation was needless. Franz was fascinated by the horrible spectacle. Oh, that's so good. So good. Loving it. Curtains. Oh, perfect timing. Okay, we are going to come to the end of this chapter right at the tail end of this stream. Perfect. Okay. Look. Here we go.
Fascinated by the horrible spectacle.
The two assistants had borne Andrea to the scaffold, and there, in spite of his struggles, his bites, and his cries, had forced him to his knees. During this time, the executioner had raised his mace and signed to them to get out of the way. The criminal strove to rise, but ere he had time, the mace fell upon his left temple. A dull and heavy sound was heard, and the man dropped like an ox on his face, and then turned over on his back. The executioner let fall his mace, drew his knife, and with one stroke opened the man's throat, and mounting on his stomach, stamped violently on it with his feet. At every stroke a jet of blood sprang from the wound. This time Franz could no longer contain himself, but sank, half fainting, into a seat. Albert, with his eyes closed, was standing, grasping the window curtains. The Count was erect and triumphant, like the avenging angel. End scene. Okay, perfect. We are let's get that cleaned up. All right, how was that for a killer execution? Executing the execution. That's a funny title for this one. We'll retitle that when we get back. Executing the execution. Oh yeah. And we are going to join these tracks together. Oh yes, please do create one contiguous file. Oh, and we are stretching because the day is only just about to begin. I mean, if you're watching this on the East Coast, your day is like you're getting to lunchtime, but we are on the West Coast, and we are just about ready to get started with our day at 9:18. Okay, we're a little early, but what we're going to do here is I'm going to go to my Streamlabs, check and see if anybody's paying attention, and see if anybody has any comments. Welcome to the chat room. And no, it looks like nobody's been around and nobody watched, but that's okay. There were 2 clicks to read your unread notifications. Oh, there's been skip detected from the standout from the crowd. What does that mean? Just a thingy. All right. Okay, well, it has been a wonderful 47 minutes and 13 seconds hanging out with you all, and I'm so glad I got to do this, and you have a lovely Thursday